Our chair for this meeting is John Carmichael. I turn it over to John to get us started.
All right, thank you, Jeff. We'll call the coordinating council to order. First bit of business is approval of the agenda. Any comments or additions on the agenda? I don't see any, so agenda is approved. Second bit of business would be approval of the previous meeting minutes. Are there any comments on the prior meeting minutes? Okay, seeing none, minutes are approved.
All right, thank you, John. Our next agenda item is consideration of the project administrative proposals. Julie Simpson, our deputy director, is going to cover this.
So I'll start with the average ranking of the maintenance proposals. There are 3 projects here that are maintenance proposals. We have the Rhode Island Black Sea Bass, the North Carolina Biological Database, and our electronic trip reporting. Hang on. Okay, I think we're good. And then in the average ranking of new proposals, next slide, we have, again, these are the values that this is ranking for both of these slides. This is the ranking of both the advisors and the operations combined. And so that's weighted as 1 vote per person. It's not the average of operations and advisors averages. So for the new projects, we had 6 new projects here. I won't read them all. These are in your meeting materials. The total of all proposals does not exceed the expected value of funding. The recommendations from the Operations and Advisory Committee, they met in September. The recommendation is to fully fund all proposals, both maintenance and new, but there were some discussions that they wanted to pass on. There was extensive discussion on the project for the collection of recreational fishing data from citizen science sources. While they do recommend fully funding this project, there were some questions about setting the precedent on the paying for a private entity for data. There was where they don't have any oversight or input into how those data are collected, how this approach might fit into the approach of citizen science as it moves forward with ACCSP and SciFish. There was a note that this is a pilot, and so they did recommend the funding for it because it was a pilot. It was being requested for development and programming. And for this particular pilot, FishBrain is waiving their data licensing fees for this year. So again, the question is, how does this fit in with SciFish? And then the final item here was the request that the PIs incorporate into their outreach efforts continued understanding and participation in MRIP surveys, with the idea that explaining this is what citizen science is, this is what it does, and to manage expectations, the purpose of this is not to replace the existing MRIP surveys. Additional recommendations were that the coordinating council determine an appropriate avenue, such as the existing funding subcommittee or perhaps a new working group, to review the potential to create guidance for the RFP on funding for application development. So what data are to be collected, how those data would be used, methods of collection, duplication of effort, and to whom those data would be transmitted. And then the last recommendation was that there was significant appreciation for the fact that the accountability work group did put in an independent proposal. However, they recommend that this type of proposal actually be incorporated into the administrative grant as an option moving forward, because while they appreciated the transparency, because of the nature of the accountability work group being a workshop, it doesn't actually make it easy to rank. And so it was one of those things where they said, you should absolutely do it, but it doesn't rank well. And it's easier to just say, we approve the admin grant with this option in it. So appreciation of the transparency, but maybe not quite so transparent in future was their recommendation there. We do have a few funding notes for this year. We did want to note that the admin grant is slightly less than last year by about $18,000. We are funding Help Desk and FSMA through other sources. We also wanted to mention the Managing 100% Lobster Harvester reporting in Maine. As many of you may have noted, that project did not appear in your maintenance proposals. They did send a letter, and that was part of the original materials that went to the operations and advisors. They have moved that implementation date back because they do have some of the funds available that they have already been distributed, and they wanted to have the opportunity to spend those funds. And so they want to push back their maintenance timeline by a year. And so they basically put a pause on their maintenance fund requests for a year. So they're sort of taking a break so that they can spend the funds that they have, but they did want to note that they would be returning next year as a maintenance proposal. Also, we wanted to point out that the initial RFP was extended through August 18th. 5 new proposals were submitted in that period. So there was a significant amount of non-proposals that didn't get submitted in the first round. The leadership team met and decided to extend that. I think this is good awareness. We wanted to share with you all that there are funds available, but we do feel like this is an interim period where the step down that has been in place for some years is kicking in, and now is a good time for new maintenance proposals to come online. So we've been working with, the staff have been working with the committees on new proposals, and we encourage everyone to work with their staffs as well on proposals for next year. And then finally, the leadership team does recommend that any unallocated funds for this year roll forward so that they can best support coastal needs next year.
Thank you, Julie, for that overview. I think we probably need to go back at least a slide, maybe 2, and have some discussion on the recommendations for sure. But is any questions for Julie on the presentation to start out? Yeah, Renee.
Julie, could you give us a little bit more info on the citizen science proposal that was discussed? I know when I read it, I shared some of the similar concerns. I talked to my ops member about it. Maybe a little bit, it sounds like it was fairly heavily discussed and controversial. So I kind of shared similar concerns, and I'd love to know a little bit more about the discussion and how everybody came to it being a pilot program, and therefore we think it should be funded. A little more context, I think, would be really helpful.
So the quick summary of the proposal is the idea. It was a little bit complicated. There was sort of a graphic in there. There's actually 2 sort of flows of data. One was coming from the application angler catch that Harbor Light created for Rhode Island, and that pathway didn't really have any concern. The other was data that would come from Fishbrain, and Fishbrain is not interested in sending data to ACCSP, and so those data would be sent to Harbor Light, who would then appropriately adjust them so that they could go through the SciFish data flow that's being created right now. Their intent is to charge money for those data. And so there were a lot of questions asked about, should we be paying for citizen science data? What is our approach to citizen science? Is it something that we want to have monetized? And so it was that idea of also where would that funding come from in coming years, because they put out a number that they waived this year, and they said they'd be willing to negotiate in future, but it is a substantial sum of money. And so they said we could try it this year and see how the pilot goes because it's not costing us anything, but we'd really have to think about whether or not we do this moving forward and how that would go. So that's what I can remember. Did you have anything else to add to that?
Thanks, Julie. Agree with that. And one of the additional questions was for volunteer anglers that are using FishBrain, they're answering questions that haven't been vetted through what the SciFish API was intended for. So there was a question about, are the data translations meeting the intent of the actual data storage? And then beyond that, it's an unknown. So this goes on both sides of the pilot issue. How will we make sure that a single trip wasn't represented in more than one data set? In one sense, it's a pilot. You have to do the work to learn that. In another sense, is that enough of an issue for everyone at the coordinating council to have a decision point or a concern?
So we have Kathy Knowlton online.
Hey, good morning. Can you guys hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Excellent, excellent. I really appreciate that some time was spent with this proposal recommendation from the Operations Committee and the advisors on this particular proposal. I think this is a really critical issue that came up the appropriate way through our process. It means our process is working. Our ranking process has done really well for many, many years, and it's pretty well equipped to deal with new ideas and innovative ideas as they arrive, and this is certainly one of them. I appreciate the detail that is drawn into the various components of why there was great discussion on this and why it deserves more conversation. However, and y'all knew I was going to put a however in there, I have great reservations about this path, and those reservations are comforted, I guess you could say, by the fact that it is a pilot project. I understand what's being said. It goes squarely in that path of you don't know what you don't know until you look into it and you try to go down the path. And that in future years, there might be levels of funding that are required that would push this to a different place in the ranking. But the conversation, I agree with operations and advisors, has to extend beyond their level. They're clearly reaching out and saying they would like some policy level discussion on how to handle these things moving into the future. When we developed primarily the commercial data collection methods and paid for that through ACCSP for the various partners, we generally were not coming up against for-profit companies that were wanting to do the same thing. And that's one of the ways in which citizen science is very different, and getting anglers to want to choose anything that rolls out through ACCSP's program with the development of SciFish, it basically puts us in a position of competing in some ways for the attention to those apps. And so we're going to have to be cognizant of that and aware of that. But paying for data is something that makes, I think, us all understandably a little bit nervous, and also paying for data through a point in time. My understanding, quickly reading this proposal, is they would only be up through FY23 when this project was done, and not forward into the future. So those are, I've got some concerns. I really appreciate them being raised in this detailed and thorough format, and I hope that this moves forward by coordinating council members, maybe in a work group with some input and from other operations committee members and others that may be interested in this, really sitting down and having a long conversation about how we deal with citizen science and using our precious, very precious funds to go down that path. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. We were waiting for your however. Yes, we appreciate that. So next up is Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just to echo what Renee and the Ops Committee and Kathy and everybody's saying, it is kind of a strange dynamic that gives me a little bit of heartburn. You got folks reporting, you got general public anglers using these apps, FishBrain, Fish Rules, and other things, and they're reporting their catch. And I think some of them are doing that with the idea or the hope that it would improve management. They give some information about discards or locations or whatever it might be, and then so this data exists, and now in order to access that data, management, ACCSP, whoever it is having to pay. They're giving $27,500 of that access this year in kind, but next year, is it close to a $30,000 bill to access the data that general anglers, citizen anglers are providing? It's just I'm not sure that all the folks putting data into these apps necessarily thought on the back end the company that they're providing this data to is going to actually sell it to someone. So, you know, that gives me quite a bit of heartburn, but, you know, I agree with the idea. Let's try it, see how it goes for a year. Is there value here? Maybe have a bigger conversation, as Kathy was suggesting, of a subgroup of this group or ops committee or something to figure out, you know, how are we going to deal with this? Because more and more data will likely end up in multiple apps up and down the, you know, up and down the coast. And what do we do to gain access to that data? Do we pay for it, or do we set up some different agreements? Do we let folks know which ones are free and which are not free as far as managers getting access to that data, and let them decide where they want to report? But I think it's a tough precedent for me to wrap my brain around and be happy about.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. I know I certainly share that as well, and I think it sits here, but a lot of those apps also do sell the idea of kind of angler diaries and just basic catch information. So this model could quickly expand to lots of other catch. So I have Lynn and then Mel on the list.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I also share a bit of the concern, although I think to some degree I can relate. You know, the state of Maryland, and I think it's been over 10 years, you know, we use a private entity to collect commercial data over SAFES, because at that time, over a decade ago, SAFES wasn't giving us what we needed. We needed a hail component that added significant accountability to our harvest. And I think, you know, fast forwarding to now, ACCSP's platforms have caught up. So one of my questions is, I think it's worth asking the question, what are these private entities collecting that's needed that can help management? And if it is helping management, how long is it even possible that ACCSP would catch up? You know, start incorporating those things into its own platform so that people can be directed there. Because part of the problem is if there's something being offered over here that's not offered through, you know, and SciFish is one of the most brilliant things I've heard about in a long time, and it has some flexibility. But I think we need to be cognizant of that gap and standing ready to fill it if need be.
Mel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think Bob had a really good point, is that there is an expectation, I believe, on the part of the folks that are utilizing these, that somehow their efforts to do this are going to go towards being applied somehow in management. And we've seen that with other applications used in other fisheries and other places where they were useful in making decisions about things, perhaps like red snapper and other fisheries earlier on. So that is just something to be cautious of with this, is that there really is, I mean, as you pointed out, there may be sort of secondary benefits, if you will. So if there's something that the individual anglers can benefit from directly from it, that's great. But I think there really is an expectation that somehow these data will be used by managers, and that's just, and again, unfortunately, it's not free to collect this data. You're dealing with a private entity they're a company. That's why they're there, to make a living. So it's just as we kind of look into this area, we have to kind of be cautious about what we could get ourselves into, because like we've said, this could get really expensive if you all of a sudden decided you really wanted a particular data and the price was what it is. And then I guess there's no price controls on this sort of thing. So it could get rather expensive.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. And I think, Jeff, maybe if you want to comment some on what they offer. I know from what I've heard talking to different apps, one of their thoughts is they offer convenience. They try to package the rules and the weather and your fishing log and all of this stuff together. So I know they certainly try to offer convenience. But, Jeff, as far as Lynn's question about there are other things in ACCSP catching up, maybe you could comment some on that.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Lynn, for the question. There's a couple of questions that I'm going to tease out of this, but there right now, when it comes to not just angler catch, but volunteer angler apps in general, there has been a proliferation of them over the last 10 years. There have been several different AFS workshops about what those applications are good for or not. And MRIP is struggling as well with how to use these voluntary reports and what they're best used for. So that's one of the great things about SciFish, because it lends in that idea that, oh, these volunteer angular things are great for, and I'll use the examples I remember, not all of them. They're great for presence absence. They're great for discards and depth and species IDs, things that are supplemental to the catch estimates that are from a probability-based sample, i.e. MRIP. So not confusing what is a probability-based sample, what can you expand for total effort, total catch, total discards, with how do you characterize those total estimates with more information about presence, absence, geographical location, discards, species IDs, etc. So the voluntary apps can do a lot of those other things. Getting back around to Lynn's question, how far behind is ACCSP and SciFish? SciFish is probably another year, maybe two, from being open to more systems to use it. So right now it has 2 apps in it later in the presentation. But there needs to be some more work to get there. So it's not a right now item. And while I have a microphone, there's one of the questions is really, is it worth funding the pilot now because there are available funds? And everybody want to bring that to the coordinating council to really discuss and decide upon. And then on the next slide, the top recommendation is whether or not it's funded, should there be a group to delve into some of these questions about future funding, application development, what is the right fit for the strategy of ACCSP funds? So maybe if we have those conversations separately, or if you wanted to ask me, that might be helpful, because in my mind, there's really 2 separate things. Yeah, Dee?
So I'll take your second question. I do think there needs to be a group. Citizen science, I think it can be useful, but I think we certainly need to set expectations and put some parameters of what we need. So other people telling us what we need to identify what we need. So, because I worry about us collecting data that's never used, and anglers have been told, oh, this data will be useful for management. We've never used it because it wasn't useful, because it was not generated from the managers is what we need. And we need bit parameters, and these competing apps, I reckon, maybe what type of feeds do they need to provide? So I reckon some structure around it. I see that as a need. The first question, there's part of me coming in here had a lot of reservations of this proposal, like others. It's a pilot, and if we set expectations, but it's kind of like, well, maybe we could fund it for 1 year, but once we dive into that and people like it and we get pressure from the public to keep funding it or something like that, that's going to be an issue, because they're going to have to step down off funding too, and then they'll start charging anglers or really sending us a bill. I don't know how that's going to look in the future. I see the dangers are in the future more than just this 1 year proposal, and I haven't really wrapped my own mind how that's going to work, but the parameters do need to be set.
Is there support for, say, let's look at the second question, maybe we knock that out, for that request there in the first bullet? Does everyone support that? I think Kathy gave a pretty good description of what went down at the ops, as we've heard, and I feel like they did their part properly and didn't have a reason to say don't fund it. They just recognized there's a kind of a new wrinkle in the system here, and they're asking for the higher level policy guidance, which to me seems completely appropriate for their perspective. So is there consensus to create a group of this type, and then we can work out who's on that, et cetera? Yes. Yeah. Kathy, yeah, you want to jump in here? Go ahead, Kathy.
Yes, I absolutely support a work group being pulled together to have these discussions, and I think it should involve some representation from the operations committee, because they've already had the detailed conversation. I think having folks involved that have been working on ACCSP's SciFish would be helpful as well. And I think we virtually almost have to fund this project because it did rank in our system, and our system is working. And if the operations and advisories committees had lengthy discussions about this and they recommend to us funding this, then it would behoove us, I think, to go with that recommendations, because they obviously struggled before we knew there was even a struggle with this one. So I am supporting it being funded with 18 caveats and asterisks following it. But yeah, they did a really good job. And again, kudos to them.
Thank you, Kathy. Jeff?
Thank you, Kathy. And Dee, I'm going to extend on the thought, this first bullet that's on screen to request this group. This bullet was brought up by the citizen science proposal, but the discussion at OPS was really beyond that as a more strategic thing within ACCSP. And that is, when ACCSP has an API that is kind of on water application agnostic, and ACCSP has a default option that's already paid for and available to all partners, when should ACCSP be funding alternate on water applications? I think it's a good point for this group to handle. I think there is a history where ACCSP wasn't ready and we funded another app to get up to speed to help a partner that would be applicable across multiple partners and regions. That includes Maryland, that includes South Carolina with their charter boat systems, that includes a couple of different perspectives and projects over time. I think that's within the realm of what ACCSP was intended to do. Get something started, make it applicable, make it flow through a centralized data collection and availability system. So certainly not saying as staff or as for speaking for anyone else that ACCSP's software should be the only thing available. But I think we've been thinking internally, as the Coordinating Council has been asking us to do for several years, about what is the best strategic use of ACCSP funds in the long term, and this question of which apps are funded, which default applications that we create should be adopted. So there's also good opportunities and examples. I know I'm kind of going a little long here, but where partners have seen Safe at Sea trips and decided to use that software as a cost-efficient method to implement trip reporting in their jurisdiction. So it's not the only option. It is an option that was intended for that expansion purpose. And that kind of option that was available for ACCSP funding. So this bullet, this work group, I completely support where I'm hearing the group go. Create this work group, include the SciFish people, include ops, include hopefully a couple of folks from Coordinating Council. But I wanted to just kind of extend that thought that it isn't just citizen science. That's kind of all applications and RFP process. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. So I have Rich Cody online.
Yeah. John, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm doing dual monitor versus phone here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Richard, we hear you.
All right. In the two bullets that are on the screen, I mean, absent from those is an actual research question. It's one thing to create an RFP that looks at app development, but really when you're talking about an app, you're talking about a logbook, basically. There needs to be some focus on what you want in that logbook, what you want in that app in terms of the data that are being collected. And that's why I'm a little bit concerned here that this is a little bit of a solution in search of a problem. We don't have a research question that's specifically identified, and that bothers me a little bit. I think there are types of things that we can look at that apps obviously would be more suited to than others, but I think that we need to have some emphasis on the types of data that we are collecting and the reason why we're collecting it. because the whole question that was brought up by Kathy ND and others about the expectation that anglers have that their data will be used. We can't go looking for a use for the data after we get the data from the angler. We have to have something, I think, in mind ahead of that. So anyway, I just wanted to put my concerns out there. And then the other point I wanted to make was related to a point that Jeff brought up earlier about MRIP, a probability-based sampling program struggling to incorporate app-based data. That's any probability-based survey that's struggling to use non-probability-based information. Obviously, there are assumptions that you can make to make the data a little bit more accessible or more useful. But I think that's a more general problem. It's not just an MRIP problem. It relates to a lot of different surveys. So anyway, I just wanted to make those 2 points, and also that I'd be in favor of a work group to look at this. There has been some efforts on the NOAA side, and I think at some of the state level as well, to look at appropriate uses for apps and things like that. The MAFAC committee under NOAA produced a report, I think earlier on this year, that looked at data gaps and the potential for using app-based reporting to fill those data gaps. So there are some sources of information that are out there also, I think, that we could latch onto with a working group. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Richard. Kathy, you back?
Of course I am. I never ever even go away. Richard's comments dovetail perfectly into what I was going to mention about one of the tasks that the SciFish work group within ACCSP has brought up to leadership. As you will recall, I think it was last June, Julia made a presentation on where we are with the development of SciFish and ACCSP, and that we will be working on developing some policy and guidance for partners as to who gets to use this tool within ACCSP, and what are the general recommendations, and what makes good project, what should be included. Are those just recommendations or are they requirements? This fits perfectly with what Richard just said in terms of getting at the issues of, at least as far as ACCSP is concerned, in terms of the minimums that are needed and the ability of projects to manage expectations. We always talk about with citizen science projects, and also what are the data going to be used for, and are they confidentiality, all of those things. So this group with the SciFish is supposed to be working on developing those in the next year. I would recommend that we find a way to combine forces and have a larger conversation that includes things that Richard just mentioned about other conversations have already been taking place through NOAA with the MAFAC and other groups. Can we please try to pull everybody into one place and maybe have a conversation, because the effort through ACCSP with SciFish is representing the entire Atlantic coast in terms of a new coordinated effort to wrap our heads around citizen science data in the marine fisheries world. We're not going to be the end all for everybody's needs, and we certainly can't force other groups and entities from creating their own apps, especially when they're for profit, but we can at least be coordinated through the Atlantic coast. And I think it would behoove us to try to dovetail both this question generally as it arose from this specific presentation, as well as what the SciFish work group has already been tasked to do. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I just want to try to wrap up discussion on the first bullet. Haven't heard anybody raising any concerns, so I sense there's support for keeping this group. Creating this group with representatives from ops, some few coordinating council folks, the SciFish group, and then, as Kathy said, trying to loop in some of the broader NIMS perspective on these things. NIMS has a citizen science program, which I'm sure our SciFish people are well aware of, because Julia's been pretty engaged with them as a result of her working on the council's citizen science program. So it'd probably be good to loop them in as well. So it sounds like we have support for that. And then we can talk about the second bullet, and then we can talk about the funding perhaps. So, Richard, I understand you had your hand raised again. So let's see what, you have something to that, or are we ready to move on? So support for the first bullet, and then the second bullet addressed the difficulty they had in dealing with the accountability workshop and really recommending that this type of thing be handled through the administrative grant. Is there any objection to handling such workshops through the administrative grant? Okay, seeing none, I think we can support that as well, Jeff. So then that brings us up to the funding action, and the ops recommendation was to fund all of the proposals. And then we also had a little bit of money left over we recommended for carrying over because we do anticipate significant future needs in the coming years. So open that up for some discussion. All right, well, I'm not seeing any. Yeah, got a draft of motion? Okay. So someone would like to, Kathy, go ahead.
I can hold on if you want. I'll definitely approve the motion, but I kind of wanted to go back to the other issue with the, I think it was the accountability work group.
Go ahead.
Can you go back up to that slide where it shows the comment that was? I'm curious as to, so the accountability work group submitted an entire proposal that everyone says, appreciate it so much, but you know, we don't need to go to this length for it, although we were really grateful that you all put in the time. Was there something that made that group think that it needed to be at the level of a proposal that was outside of just being completely transparent? And then my second part of that would be, I support the recommendation that workshops and similar activities be included as optional in the administrative grant, but I would like to see some level of detail in the administrative grant, perhaps not as long as what was given in this proposal, but it be written up as a fairly detailed item that's an optional item in the administrative grant so that people can really dig into it and see what it's about, would be my recommendation. Thank you.
I think Julie, were you gonna, or was it Jeff? I forget which one. Oh, Jeff was, sorry. Jeff can go ahead. Don't, you guys do whoever needs to do it. Don't listen to me.
We make it work. It's all good. Kathy, thank you. We were called out for being a little over transparent by ops in this case. What really happened was when the coordinating council tasked the accountability work group last May to kind of follow through and take the next steps, that process and the extended RFP allowed for an opportunity to put in a proposal to fund the workshop and make people aware. So that's why we submitted it as a full proposal. And I certainly appreciate your comments about not making it a short paragraph in the admin grant as an option. I think having the proposal there as an appendix that can be fully evaluated is an excellent suggestion, and really kind of where my mind would be on that already. So having it clear, having it there, but the type of work for that, we as staff did not want to kind of hide in and bury into an admin grant proposal that wouldn't be clear about a choice. And we also didn't want to overemphasize kind of the funding choices that were happening. And when it turns out we created that, put it in front of operations committee, there was a process problem where it didn't fit the ranking criteria. And that was a whole lot of the discussion. It, again, as Julie pointed out, wasn't a bad idea, just wasn't easy to be ranked.
Well, and I think that having it, like you said, is embedded as an appendix, also gives the operations and advisors the option for commenting on the extra or the optional task, and still you can relay at the bottom of the recommended funding for future years from operations and advisors that they recommended this be included, and that still would be part of the discussion of the coordinating council, and it helps a lot. And I kind of wish we had an award that was named being overly transparent, because this was awesome.
All right, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I think that was some good added guidance to staff there for sure. So I think we can go back to the funding motion and ask that someone may perhaps read that out. Give us a second to switch screens. So anybody wish to make this as a motion?
You guys are way too shy around here. You gotta wake up. So yeah, move to approve the ACCSP FY 2023 projects as presented to the ACCSP Coordinating Council with unallocated funds to be held in ACCSP admin grant for future determination.
And a second by Mr. Reed. Thank you. Megan?
More of a question, and Jeff or Julie, this is not to put you guys on the spot, but for the work group on the application, funding for application development, I'm curious if you have a sense of the time frame of how that work group may operate, because I think I can support the motion today knowing it's a pilot project, that citizen science project, but I think it would be really great to have a better footing or framework of how we want to move forward should we see this next year. That work group, though, seems like it's, even just in the 30 minutes we've been here, evolved into something that's pretty large. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how quickly that group can actually accomplish a growing task.
It would probably need a couple of meetings to begin with and then fold into the funding work group. And because that would be part of the RFP. We'd have to talk internally and figure out if that could happen before the before the RFP that normally goes out in May of 2023. That does seem like a tight timeline. Julie, you want to add anything? Thank you, Julie.
We're sidebarring.
The point was that the SciFish small group that's working on policy would probably make some progress before then. However, it wouldn't be formalized in the RFP by May. So I think there's opportunity to make progress on some of that committee. Again, I took those recommendations as kind of separate actions. So there's an actual motion for the funding of the proposals that we have in front of you today. And then if there's a desire for a separate motion or just an understanding to move forward on creating that work group, we'll get started.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think as much as we can keep those on somewhat parallel tracks, so we're just in a better position for that conversation next year, I think would behoove us, but acknowledge that there's only so many hours in the day. So,
Any other discussion? Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment on the unallocated funds. You know, some of the conversations we had early in this meeting were to hold those funds until it almost sounded like next year's RFP process, but I actually kind of prefer the way the motion is worded, kind of open-ended, where there's parked for a while. You know, maybe a high priority need comes up later this year, get the leadership committee together and decide we can use those funds later this year if that were to happen. So I think though I like the way the motion is worded now. It seems to be a little bit more flexible than necessarily holding on to these and waiting a full year before you work on it. So yeah, I think, you know, just want to make that point. We may, if something really were to pop up, I don't know what that would be, we might be able to tap into those funds if we had to.
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't know what will pop up. All right, anyone else? Okay, so is there any objection to the motion? Anybody online raising their hand or anything? Okay, no objection, then the motion carries. So next, Jeff.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for your conversation and discussion on that and action. Our next item is for consideration of the Atlantic Recreational Implementation Plan for 2023 through 2027. This is an action item. So just as a quick reminder, and it's in the summary that you got, the regional recreational implementation plans were originally requested and developed for MRIP, and they use the 5 or 6 regional implementation plans to set national priorities. And they're supposed to be updated when regional priorities shift, or every 5 years. This would be the second Atlantic plan, and after that 5-year timeline. And as part of the MRIP Regional Implementation Council, ACCSP represents the Atlantic partners, gathers input, and puts all that together to represent the activities and major priorities. And so while this document is for delivery to MRIP, the ACCSP approach is really to collate this not just for tasks for funding for MRIP, but also part of the ACCSP request for proposals and or supplemental data to MREP that could be used in assessments and management. So it's kind of trying to double dip the effort and make sure that we get everyone's regional priorities here. That said, next slide. Thank you. As you all discussed in May, you asked for kind of a re-ranking of these things and removal of citizen science as an actual priority, which we agreed with. So it's been moved down as a tool that could be used to address any of these priorities. The improved in-season monitoring remained at priority number 6 in this numerical ranking. I will say that because of the re-ranking procedure activity, a lot of these got very close in their scores and almost rotated in their order between items 3 through 6. It was kind of the 3, 4, and 5 and 6 that almost swapped, but they were very close. It was a good approach to go through, and I appreciate everything that the council and RecTech did to get us here. Just as a reminder, the reason that items 1 and 2 are still on the list is because even though MREP has, through Modern Fish Act, provided funds to increase the dockside APIS sampling, that's really only been completed for almost 2 years now, 2021 and 2022. And so that needs to kind of continue on to see if it has the effects in the data that are expected by doing all those additional sampling assignments. And while I'll touch on progress on the comprehensive for-hire data collection, again, that's a work in progress and still is a priority to continue there. So we had advice to keep those in place. With that, I'm not going to walk you through more of the document. I would ask for discussion and a motion.
Yeah, any discussion on this? Appreciate you guys updating that and taking the guidance and making those changes. Do you have a draft motion already drafted, perhaps?
We do, and we're working on showing it.
Cool. I had a feeling you might. Have Kathy online?
Yes, I was just going to congratulate you all. I think you all did a really good job on a highly detailed and informative document that can be picked up by a lot of people who are just delving into the challenges for collecting marine recreational fisheries data. They can read this and really get a good idea of what's going on, what the various surveys and programs are, and where we still have needs on the Atlantic coast. So you all did an excellent job of getting this information ready, and hopefully it will be of high utility to NOAA for conversations about future developments within MREP. And I would be happy to make the motion and read it as given, if that's okay with you all. I'm going to take that as a yes.
Oh, yes, please do.
Okay, I move to approve the Atlantic Recreational Implementation Plan 2023 to 2027 as presented to the ACCSP Coordinating Council.
Second by Mr. Bell. Any more discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? All clear on the line? Okay, thank you. Motion stands approved.
Thank you very much. We will finish that up. And again, the next step is to submit that to MREP now that it has been finally approved. And that dovetails well into the larger MREP process where they're getting updated implementation plans from all the regions while they finish their next 5-year strategic plan. And so that's great news. Thank you. With that, Mr. Chair, I see you nodding. I can head right into the program updates.
I think that would be fine. Keep us moving along. It's probably an important board to come along here soon.
Great. Thank you. Next slide, please. We'll run through some topics that we have been working on that are kind of exciting to us and I think to all of you. So the first one here is really an update on the confidentiality process. This is based on PRFC now sending us direct detailed data. The confidentiality for and so congratulations to PRFC and exciting for us. The confidentiality used to be through Virginia. So if you had access to Virginia, you would get access to the PRFC data. Those that had, and so the new process, we've got a new partner on the confidentiality form that will get signed off and people will request it. We can be much more granular in that approach and the timelines. And so we're kind of excited to have this take the next step. Though, for those who have confidential access today, how will this affect you? The first thing is those that have access today through Virginia will have that access until it expires. All access through Virginia has a 1-year timeline. So instead of expiring everybody all on the same day and making them go into the website and request another one and putting a burden on PRFC, we said, let's let them expire on the dates that they naturally would. And when they do, if those people want access back to PRFC data, they will specifically request it, and therefore that'll be handled by PRFC staff to review and approve or take action on those next steps. So congratulations to PRFC. Thanks for letting us move a step further in the granularity of this. Next slide. Highlight on data dissemination activities. So we finished the fall release of the calendar year 2021 landings. There's a spring data load and then the fall, which is more complete. This has a smaller change to the landings where either different items were collected or late and reports were entered, but that was completed on time. I think it was released September 19th, which is right on our normal schedule. We've been hitting those data, spring and fall data releases pretty consistently for the past 4 years. So the data team and the rest of us are pretty proud of getting that done. And that relies on all of your staff getting that data cleaned up, squared away, and sent to us on time. So a roundabout thank you to all of you. They've also provided data to 8 SOC assessments listed there, 5 FMP reviews, and one of our action items this year was to develop a searchable online inventory for the biological on bycatch programs. So this isn't the raw data, it is the references to what type of biological programs are out there, who are the contact points, and what kind of information is collected by them. Along the same vein, another action item was to add information to the biological data module, and staff have been working really hard with both the TIP data and the South Atlantic states. This is a process improvement where in the past, the South Atlantic states would collect, the TIP data would be collected, they would send it to ACCSP and to TIP, and then we would have to get filtered back around another way. So it was kind of double effort. And what we're working on now is to have the states send that TIP information to ACCSP, we'll compile it, and then send it back down to, I think it's Miami, the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. So process improvement there. And continuing to support the CFIRE data flows for the for-hire in the South Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico. That is both through adjustments and changes to the Safest eTrips application, the API itself that collects the data, and at least the other primary app that collects this on the water is Bluefin's vessel software, which submits again through the ACCSP API, and then it goes down to the Southeast Fisheries Science Center in CIRO. Moving on, another big item on partnerships, back to MRIP. We have hit another milestone of sharing data systems that were developed for MRIP and through ACCSP across regions. It's both fiscally efficient and it standardizes the survey implementation and speeds the data delivery. So on the APIS tablets, we've talked about these for a few years. ACCSP's had them in the field since 2019. The Gulf states, 3 states implemented that in 2022, and NOAA is now asked for our help. We've provided them the software so they can deploy that for Hawaii in 2023. So we're in the aspects of sharing that each region has their own database for it and supports their own users, but it uses essentially the same tablets, essentially the same program. And while there is a little bit of flexibility within the regions, it really standardizes things, and it has been great because so many more users will give feedback on what are the priority items to make changes to, what makes the survey work better for staff, what makes it work better for data processing, what makes it work better for those of us in the middle handling that data, doing and passing that on to MRIP. And it gives MRIP a little bit more time to do their work to create the estimates and review the data before the final, the regular release of the information. The other aspect is the for-hire telephone survey and the state conduct. Again, ACCSP developed the computer-assisted interview or computer-guided survey. That's been in play for several years with the states doing those telephone calls. Gulfin implemented this for their 3 states, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, in September of this year, and that's saving them a lot of time, and they're excited about that. Again, joint application and development, proving some benefits. Next slide. The other piece of that has been a good collaboration has been the MREP Social Economic Add-on Survey. This is part of the APIS dockside interviews. It's done about every 5 years. Last one was on paper in 2017. This year was in the tablet. And that screen there is just what the tablet looks like. So on the far right side, you can kind of toggle between anglers and get those answers a lot faster. And it does a lot of skip logic, so you don't ask questions that you don't have to, depending on the response to the previous question. It's been a while. Next slide. It's been a while since we showed you a graph today, so we have to have a data graph. And this one shows the light bars are the SEAS survey in 2017 by state. The darker bars are 2022. The main point here is 75% completion rate of SEAS for all the access interviews that are occurring, and that's 10% higher than it was 5 years ago. Kudos again to the states, as well as those helping to develop an application that was a lot more streamlined in getting it done. Next slide. I promised talking about the comprehensive for-hire data collection program again. The focus items here are on the development of methodology that does not exist in a current program today, but it is the blending of an electronic logbook reporting with did not fish reports, using the APIS as the dockside catch validation survey, using an estimation for boats that are under a approved logbook based on a South Carolina pilot, and hailouts are listed as an optional component. For those vessels that do not have a logbook requirement based on their permit, those would continue to be surveyed under the FHTS effort survey with a dockside catch survey. So the progress point here between your last meeting, we first submitted the actual documentation to MREP on June 14th. They did an excellent job getting us a response back and comments on August 3rd. A lot of that had to do with delineation between core and optional. What was the specific math of the 4 options in the South Carolina project that we wanted to recommend, and clear language and overall reformatting. We've made those changes and we'll probably submit that back to MREP in the next week or 2. Moving down to software development, the major priorities in those blue chevrons have been presented before, but I did want to highlight for looking forward into next year, our major item in 2022 development has been adjusting the species list by reporting platform. That's important so that the species on a dealer report can be a different list of what species, market, grades, units of measure are visible on a commercial trip report or a for-hire trip report. And separating out which options are available to the software and presented through the API is going to really tighten down those lists and end up with higher quality data in the end. You wouldn't want to choose goosefish livers landed whole on a fishing trip. And those things don't, I just made that one up. But any kind of oddity like that, right now having a single list, every once in a while we get some strange choices that sneak in there. The other one is working on lobster tracking. Anyone who's in the lobster board meeting today or earlier, it's adding in the ability for ACCSP API to accept the ping locations for lobster vessels, as well as present some of the lobster tracks to the state administrators through the Safest Management System application. Those things are slated for 2023 rollout. During next year, we're looking at updating the registration tracking. That's been evaluated a few years ago, and we're now ready to address it. That has to do with how participants, fishermen, dealers, corporations, vessel owners, vessel operators, all interact with which permits and what records can be shown. And of course, when you log into a data entry application, what questions are then asked of you. So this registration tracking is kind of a critical component before moving forward to 2024 and doing the electronic dealer reporting redesign. So yes, that does feel like it's a long way out, but if we didn't do the species list now, if we didn't do the registration tracking first, it would require double effort of the same task to do it once for trip reporting and then having to revisit it again. So this is kind of the most streamlined approach that the software team and database folks have worked out to do this. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see these are just the new big items. On the left-hand side of the screen are the new big items. On the right side, those are all the continuing things that are happening on a regular basis that takes a lot of staff time and a lot of effort to keep up with changing partner needs. Who's doing this work? Well, next slide. We have a whole new software team. In March, we hired Jamal Udidin and Daniel Mestawat. They are fantastic. They're learning really fast. They're picking up on different aspects of CEFIS, things like message of the day, what's going on with some of these biological inventories. They're picking up, they're really moving pretty quickly, and that's great. Karen Holmes has decided to kind of recalibrate. She started her change from a full-time staff to a contractor on August 1st. We have her through the end of this year on limited hours, but thank you to Karen for her 18 years. She started literally in May, I think it was 2004, just before the first CEFIS electronic dealer reporting was ready to go online. And so she has brought us a long way, and we thank Karen for her efforts. And to backfill her spot, we have selected an individual who starts December 1st, and we'll put that out in our committee newsletter once he actually comes on board. So we're excited to be kind of fully staffed again. We're getting there. We might, depending on conversation, we might be close to our 245 timeline. There's a prediction for you. We have been working on spatial data tools. This is something that with new versions of Application Express, some staff that have the Lobster project and some staff that have experience with some spatial data, we've got several new things that are happening. So the graphic there on that new feature on trip plotting is out on our outreach table. But we've been working both with the Lobster trip location tracking to accept those locations, the partner agency visibility that I mentioned before. There are CEFIS interactive area code map location pickers in some of the applications and on the website now to help identify multiple fields. So that would be not that the data elements are no longer required, but make it easier for users to select them. So if you punch your finger on a point, you can say, oh, here's the area, here's the sub area, here's the local area, this might be the lobster management area, this might be the 10-minute grid square, but you might be able to get 5 questions answered with just a single finger push. And that makes things a lot easier on the end user and ultimately ends up in data that aligns better and is of higher quality. And the last one is really this CEFIS mobile on-device trip plotting. So this is the ability to, at the user's discretion and on their own device, create that kind of plot line for what their fishing trip was. These things are interesting and kind of set the stage for capabilities that we may be able to expand upon in the future. 2 more items we've under the updates. Actually, sorry, 3. On one-stop reporting, this has really been a crux of where CEFIS eTrips is going. It's enabling a fisherman with permits in multiple jurisdictions to support a single electronic vessel trip report and have that pass from ACCSP out to the proper agencies. This was part of the, and at the moment, SAFES was the first and remains the only reporting option that fits this need. I will note that while the SAFES application and data storage are in place and the partners are really helping out, the implementation will also require kind of some joint council actions. And a little more to that on the next slide. So about a year ago, Garfo implemented the electronic reporting for commercial and for hire. That has gone really well and integrated fantastically for those with HMS permits. And even for those that are dual permitted in the South Atlantic. However, Southeast Fisheries Science Center, South Atlantic Council, Gulf Council, and HMS are still collaborating with ACCSP on how to use SAFES e-trips for the coastal logbooks and for the pelagic longlines. Those are some choices about regulatory changes, aligning which questions get asked, and what would be accepted. And right now, there are issues with the Southeast permit system, which delays implementation of that and one-stop electronic reporting beyond our these Garfo dual permitted boats. So right now, there's a very limited number of vessels that are able to use this OSR function between Garfo and South Atlantic. We're looking to get that moving forward, but until some of these permit database issues are squared away, we're kind of waiting for, again, the joint action of the councils, as well as some data work outside of ACCSP to get done. Rolling right through here, but our next slide is back to SciFish. So we alluded to a few of these things before. So, of course, citizen science is potentially very powerful to understand marine fish populations, what things are happening. There's a ton of growing interest here. And the long-term goal of SciFish, and I'll read it off the bottom, is to develop a citizen science mobile application and menu-driven project builder interface that ACCSP partners could use to easily create a customizable application by selecting specific data fields without the need to develop standalone applications for each new project or data need. So this won't answer everything, but it will align some ability to create a customized application, centralized data storage, availability to the assessment and management after the fact, and knowledge of how those questions are being developed. SciFish has been a developing platform and activity, three major phases. The first was to combine two existing apps, the South Atlantic Council's release and the North Carolina Catch You Later apps, into the SciFish app. That has been completed. Under phase 2, launch SciFish with these two projects, expand the species to meet some other data needs, and develop the SciFish project builder. That is also underway and laying the groundwork for policy. This summer, and then phase 3 is to continue the data collection, develop that policy guidance, finish the SciFish project builder, and then move it on from prototype into production. On the next slide, we did meet with the SciFish group, met with the ACCSP leadership team back in June. They suggested that draft policies of how to handle things like what questions should be asked, how would a program apply to be part of this, that get written and drafted by the current SciFish group, and then with membership and input from the technical committees, operations, and advisors. This is the same group we talked about earlier today. Develop that advisory group, and then once the policies are drafted, that final approval would either lie with operations committee or coordinating council as appropriate, so that we don't spend too much time in the weeds at coordinating council. Next slide is about outreach. You see Julie and I are wearing new ACCSP outfits. Yay! We have our staff shirts on. Also, there were new handouts and stickers out there. There's different outreach items that are available. There's phone cases and some dry bags and some hats. You all have a hat in front of you for those of you who are here, so enjoy that if you're out maybe doing the Laura Leach fishing tournament tomorrow night when it gets cold. You've got a hat. So there you go. But anyway, we are excited to have those things, but more consistently and a wider audience. We've been keeping up with the committee newsletters. Those were in your packets. Julie and Marissa have been generating weekly tweets. Those have been getting a really good feedback as well and contributing to the ASMFC communications plan, both through Fisheries Focus and the Atlantic Coast Fisheries News. So that is the end of the program updates. And did you want to entertain questions?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes at ACCSP, Jeff, so I appreciate you taking that time to hit on that many things, because as we know, there's a lot of people back there working to keep this thing moving smoothly and to make the many advances that you went over, so I appreciate that. Anybody have any questions for Jeff on all of those items? Yes, Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did not have heard that. I continue to love the committee updates, and just to thank the staff for all of their hard work. Oh, and you may have to verify your identity on Twitter going forward, just FYI.
Send another comment about ACCSP keeping up. No problem.
Okay, any questions online, or we're good to move ahead? Okay, thank you. So we have some more business. My illustrious term as chair has gone by in a rapid 2 years. Jason, I think, looks like he's here, so he's ready to take over as chair perhaps, and we'll hand it over to Jeff to handle this bit of administrative business.
All right. Before we actually do a nomination for vice chair, so number one, congratulations, Jason. You're the new chair. And before we do nominations for vice chair, I did want to take this moment. I'm being corrected. We need a motion for Jason to be chair.
So somebody like to make a motion? Yes, Dan. Thank you. You want to read that out?
Yes, motion to elect Dr. Jason McNamee as the coordinating council chair.
And a second? Jim. Any discussion on the motion? We got a second.
Oh.
Jim. All right. Looks like we're caught up on the screen. Any objections? All right. Seeing none. Congratulations, Jason.
Okay. Let's stick with this then. We need to nominate a new vice chair. See a hand. I see a hand, Lynn.
Lynn.
Thank you. I would like to nominate my good friend from the state of Georgia, Kathy Milton, as vice chair. I guess I would move to do so. Thank you.
I saw a lot of second hands down at the end. We'll go with D for the second, since she's retiring and leaving us. Awesome. Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? See, it just goes, yeah, please, Jim.
Just Kathy may want to know, many years ago when I was elected vice chair, I said, and Eric Smith was the chair. He said, don't worry, you'll have 2 years to learn this stuff. And then he retired the next meeting. So just so you know, Kathy, there's always surprises with this committee.
Yeah, you never know. Poor Lynn had to do chair for 3 years. Kathy, do you accept the nomination?
I do. I would just like to say, Lynn and Dee, nicely done. Nicely done to both of my esteemed colleagues indeed. And it's sort of a requirement, given my level of comments, but I still have a very large interest in ACCSP, even though I've been involved for over 20 years. So thank you. I appreciate y'all's confidence.
All right. Is there any objection to the motion? And no, Kathy, you can't object either. So seeing none, the motion stands approved. We now have new leadership. Excellent. Thank you.
Yay, thank you. I would like to take a moment before we get off this item to extend a heartfelt thank you to John for his leadership and centering guidance over the last 2 years as chair, as well as informally since we first connected on the ASMFC to TOG management plan in the late 90s. But yeah, John, we have added you to the plaque of coordinating council chairs. So, which we do hang outside of the, in the commission office. But anyway, we've got you on the list. So
All right.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
Jeff. That's quite a cast of characters for sure. Seems like only yesterday you were a graduate student working on TOG, that's for sure.
I think we do have one more item under other business, and this, Dee, would you mind coming up to visit us? So Dee, this is her last meeting. We wanted to get you a gift and a very large card. But anyway, Dee has been with ACCSP for 27 years, if I have that correct.
Yes.
I consider Dee one of our founding members from the original MOU creation crowd in 1995. Roles on literally, I think, every committee that's ever been part of ACCSP. And thank you for your, guidance and continuation of thoughtful processes and moving us forward and kind of keeping us accountable to ourselves and to each other and moving things forward. A lot of the funding decision and step down processes were things that you and Kathy and others weighed in a lot on. And anyway, thank you and good luck.
Thank you.
I appreciate this. I really do. I am retiring. Have retired, kind of, but retired in place, not for the past month. But the ACCSP I consider just as much part of my career as the Division of Marine Fisheries, and we've achieved a lot of items. North Carolina, we kind of come from the Gulf end. I was trying to explain that earlier this morning where we came from, but it's been a lot of evolution. We didn't even have staff. I think we borrowed staff from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to start off. But we've come a long ways, and I'm very proud to see what's been achieved on the entire Atlantic coast, and I'm very proud of being part of it and part of the people I've met throughout time and everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, would you like you ready to adjourn, or you have other items?
Is there any other business? I don't have any other items, so it's 2:50. We came pretty darn close to 2:45. I think the coordinating council is adjourned.